The last thing I remember from that night was the sound. Not dramatic, not cinematic in the way movies pretend abandonment sounds, just an ordinary, clean click, the back door latch closing, then the small, steady rattle of rain against the porch roof. Everything after that settled into a kind of slow-motion clarity, a folded note on the kitchen table, a backpack with half a sandwich in a Ziploc, my hoodie draped over a chair like they had tried to leave me a shape of myself they expected I'd fill later. They were gone before dawn. I was 13. If you think that line, 13, a note, a backpack, is the end of the story, you haven't met my Uncle Henry. He showed up 2 days later with a suitcase, a spare key, and a look that said he was neither sentimental nor interested in drama. He was interested in solutions. He took me in, put me in his spare room that smelled faintly of cedar and new leather, and fixed my life in small, deliberate ways that weren't about grand gestures. He made sure there were clean sheets, that I had a school uniform, that I knew where the cereal was. But the gifts that changed the course of my life weren't things you can wrap. They were rituals. Sunday morning pancakes, back when I still thought syrup was an acceptable food group. The sound of his typewriter when he was sorting mail late at night. Yes, he had a typewriter. He liked to say it kept him honest. And the rules he lived by, which he delivered with the same dry humor he used to refuse dessert. "Keep receipts," he said once, like it was a punchline. "Trust no one who says, 'Trust me,' without a paper trail." I laughed then. I don't laugh thinking about that night now. The humor has teeth. It bit me enough to teach me a lesson. He turned that maxim into a practice. He would say it as he handed me a stack of envelopes. School forms, insurance, the certificate from your piano recital, everything goes into the box. The box lived under his bed. He called it the life box. It wasn't poetic, but it was useful. Uncle Henry was wealthy in the way that men of his generation, from old family money that had been diversified into boring things, like warehouses and municipal bonds, are wealthy. You could feel the confidence everywhere in the house, in the heavy drapes, in the garden that didn't try too hard, in the way he never fumbled with a problem. He wasn't flashy, he was careful. He taught me how to be careful. Those lessons were practical at first. He showed me how to balance a checkbook when I was 15. He explained what a trust was, not the dry legalese, but the logic. It's a way to hold assets for someone else, so the person who manages them can't run off with them. He said, think of it as a lockbox with a locksmith you can sue, which made me laugh out loud and then promptly wrote it down. He also taught me to notice the small anomalies that signaled larger errors. A bank statement that arrives late, a check that clears the day after it's written, a name that appears in an email thread where it doesn't belong. Most people ignore a paper mistake, he told me, while we sat under the lamp at his kitchen table. That's the problem. Paper doesn't make mistakes. People do. I absorbed it like a survival skill, combining the ordinary teenage things with an education in documenting life. The more he taught me, the less I felt like the 13-year-old left with a sandwich. The life he offered was less like a lifeboat and more like a map, and I started learning the routes. We had rules. They were simple. Keep a list of who owes you favors, file everything, and don't answer calls from relatives after midnight unless you have coffee. He introduced me to the family ledger, an old spreadsheet that tracked loans, advances, who had borrowed money, and who had paid it back. It was, on its face, a boring relic of thrift, but it was how he taught me to see relationships as transactions. Not coldly, he didn't reduce human beings to line items, but he trained my eye to see that when a name kept appearing in the red, there was a pattern worth chasing. What I didn't know then was how much I would need that habit, the habit of archiving, of keeping an extra envelope, of scanning everything and saving it on 2 different drives. I didn't know how often the world would try to prove to me that paper is forgettable and people are unreliable. I only knew that Uncle Henry's house felt safer than the last one, and that his rules made me feel like the future could be organized. Years went by. I finished high school with honors, partly because Uncle Henry had a thing for tutors who insisted on discipline, and partly because paperwork is useful when you want scholarships. He helped with college applications, the way a strategist helps with a campaign: prioritize, prep, assert. He signed financial forms, co-signed a loan when the first jobs paid like jokes, and he taught me how to read a contract without falling asleep. He didn't smother me, he let me go when it was time, but he left habits that would later read like a cheat code for survival. The family, though, never really reconciled with my new life. Some of them treated me as if my childhood was a scandal they wanted to forget. Others used the narrative as a pet story at dinner parties. "You know, poor Maya," they'd say, as if it were an accent, the sort of relatives who clap when somebody mentions bad luck and then expect you to laugh about it along with them. You learn, very quickly, who thinks of you as a project, who as an embarrassment, and who as a threat. The first real stain on the calm we had built wasn't dramatic. It was a folded note hidden inside a used birthday card from Aunt Celeste, the family's unofficial social director. I found it because I was looking for a receipt and the note caught my eye, a line scratched in pen about moving funds and a ledger number. I didn't understand everything at first. It was like seeing a single piece of a jigsaw puzzle and feeling, without seeing the rest, that the picture would be ugly if completed. I filed that note into the life box. I made a copy. A small humiliation happened not long after, the kind that sounds petty when you tell it, but it was the crack that let light into a rotten place. It was at a summer reunion, the kind where everyone brings potato salad and pretends the past didn't occur. The table was long and bright, sunlight cutting across the tablecloth in hard squares. Aunt Celeste had invited a couple of local journalists under the pretense of updating the family history, and the air buzzed with that faux civility that people use when they want to look important. During dessert, Aunt Celeste made a speech. Nothing wrong with speeches, except hers ended in, "And of course we all trust who carries the family's stewardship forward," and she looked straight at me like she was confirming something I hadn't applied for. The silence that followed was a kind of social shove. My chest tightened. I felt like I had been placed on a display for people to measure me against some imaginary standard. The humiliation was compact and efficient, a poorly disguised side-eye from a cousin, a whispered joke that I was the kid who fell into fortune, the glances as if my presence were an inconvenience. None of it was violent, it was worse, it made me small. I left the table early, walked home past the hydrangeas, breathing and trying to sort through how something as simple as a speech could feel like a referendum on my life. That night, Uncle Henry didn't ask what had happened. He had a way of knowing when words would only sharpen the wound. Instead, he made tea, sat across from me, and opened his drawer. He took out an envelope and set it on the table. Inside were copies of letters I'd never seen, correspondence between some family members and the firm that managed parts of the estate, handwritten notes, an accountant's memo. "People confuse stewardship with ownership," he said, his voice low. "Stewardship is temporary. A trustee remembers to pay the bills and to keep the place in order. Ownership makes you think nothing is ever owed to anyone." I remember flipping through those papers and feeling a quiet, cold certainty in my stomach. The papers were small anomalies alone, but stacked together they suggested someone was rearranging who looked after what. There were transfers that made no sense to me, small at first, then bigger. A payment here, a canceled line item there, an invoice that had been altered in a way that would take a forensic eye to notice. It would have been easy to dismiss all of it as family politics. Most people would have, but those drawer of envelopes lessons stuck to me. But the deeper I dug, the more I noticed a pattern of intentionality. There were transfers to businesses I had never heard of, payments described in vague language, consulting fee, vendor's settlement, that didn't match any vendor we could name. There were signatures that looked slightly off when you squinted at them, my spreadsheet filled with question marks and dates. Then came the laptop. It was an old Dell that belonged to the family office administrator who had retired the previous year. Grandma Rose had kept it in a drawer because she couldn't bear to toss anything that had belonged to the administration. She handed it to me like she was passing along a relic. "It's probably full of recipes," she warned, with a smile built on decades of mischief. I took it home, dusted it off, and powered it up. The screen came to life slowly, humming like a sleeping animal. There were files scattered everywhere: spreadsheets, PDFs, email archives. The first folder I opened was labeled General, and then something else in a hand that strained to be private: Family-Holdings. There it was, an old accounting file with entries I hadn't expected. Not just small transfers, but references to a trust account that had been changed, a previously appointed trustee replaced, line items labeled reimbursement to Celeste, with amounts that, when accumulated, were not small. I felt the familiar bubble of breath in my chest, that mix of adrenaline and dread you get when a pebble down a hill starts an avalanche in your mind. I made a copy of the files onto the encrypted drive, then another copy onto a physical hard drive. I kept a printed list of folders I accessed and times I accessed them, the chain of custody habit rearing its useful, obsessive head. Because this was the early days of our little investigation, and we weren't ready to involve anyone else, I worked in the manner of a cautious person, quietly, legally, meticulously. I did not download, distribute, or accuse. I looked. I organized. I created a document that cataloged what I found, with notes: where it came from, who had access, and why it was suspicious. I used plain language. I didn't try to be clever. Suspicious meant appears inconsistent with what I know about how this family has handled its finances. There were attachments, too: PDFs that looked like invoices, scans of checks with endorsers' names, and an email chain that included the family attorney and Aunt Celeste. The email itself was innocuous in tone. You could read it quickly and let it go, but an attachment within it, a spreadsheet saved with a new name, had numbers that didn't match the public statements. There were footnotes in tiny font that implied payments were routed through intermediaries for expediency. When you spend enough time with numbers, they stop being numbers and start being voices. Sums that move inexplicably, dates that are rewritten, and lines that sketch a path away from the family utility and into something opaque. It's like listening to a conversation with one person speaking from behind a curtain. You can't see them, but you can hear them rearranging things. I called Uncle Henry and told him that the laptop had something. He didn't say much at first. "Keep everything exactly as it is," he said. "No forwarding, no screenshots on personal accounts. We catalog and we wait for the pattern to be firm." We waited. In that waiting, the most dangerous thing is not action, but the temptation to be loud. I bit my tongue. I kept my notes. I made sure every file had a backup and a timestamp. At night, I would lie awake thinking about the way people lose things: to greed, to sloppy bookkeeping, to a slow apathy that convinces them that someone else can pick up the slack. I thought of the dinner table when Aunt Celeste spoke, and the way she angled words like a bow. I thought of Regina, a cousin who laughed the loudest at her jokes, and who had once borrowed a small amount from the family and never repaid it. Every anchor point in my mind became a line on the map. The first direct sign of hostility was not a lawsuit or a fistfight. It was a text message at 2 a.m. "Stop digging where it doesn't concern you," the message read. No name, no contact, just a plain instruction that wanted to be obeyed. I stared at the phone and then at the lit ceiling. I told myself it was a prank. I told myself it was cowardice disguised as power. I told myself a lot of things to avoid the possibility that someone had noticed someone was poking around. The second sign was calculated: a voicemail left on Uncle Henry's office line from an unknown number. Short, lawyer-sounding. We represent certain parties in your family. Cease and desist any unauthorized access to private files. This communication is notice." The voice was all velvet, the sort used to admonish without appearing to raise a hand. It was the first time the investigation stopped being a private domestic thing and began to get those formal public contours that make people lean in. The idea that someone might be watching our movement or preparing for our movement was a cold wind. Uncle Henry read the transcript of the voicemail and then made tea. He did not panic. He rarely panicked. Instead, he called two people: an old friend who had been a corporate compliance officer, and a young paralegal who owed him a favor. "Time to make an audit trail," he said to me. "Proper discovery is not a hobby, it's a legal discipline." I learned the meaning of discovery then, practically. In law, discovery is the formal exchange of information where each side must hand over documents. It's tedious, exacting, and if done right, it makes hidden things visible on the record. Uncle Henry liked the idea of making things visible on the record because it turned rumor into something you could litigate. We compiled the documents we had and prepared a cover memo that explained, in plain language, why these items were material. We didn't file anything yet. What we did do was make sure that if and when we needed to, we could show that the data had been handled responsibly. It felt like loading a fire hose. It was, in truth, the most useful precaution. Legitimacy has a smell. It is the smell of orderly paper and dated signatures. That same week, Aunt Celeste called. Her voice on the phone was the social voice she used at all family events. Warm, just sharp enough to cut through nonsense. "Henry," she said, "we need to talk about the estate. There are people who are worried that things aren't being handled properly." It was a curious choice of words. She had a way of suggesting alarm while simultaneously positioning herself as the calm center. It was the language of a person who intended to be in control if a problem appeared. When you suspect foul play in a family, the first responses are always instructive. Some people deny, some people run to flames, some people try to fix it alone. Aunt Celeste did none of those things. She cast a net instead. She invited the family to a meeting, announced on social media a refreshing of the family governance structure, and mentioned in passing that outside consultants would be reviewing matters. If the laptop had been the first window, this meeting was the rain that made everything visible once water finds a crack. The meeting was a month away. Between the voicemail and the meeting, uncertainty sat in the house like a guest who never left. The family ledger, the life box, the notebook of Grandma Rose, all of it felt like a single rope stretched taut over an abyss. Someone had thrown down the rope, and it was my decision whether to cross or to step back. I began to notice small tactical moves that suggested the other side, whoever the other side was preparing their narrative. There were subtle social media posts that implied, without saying, that those who spoke loudly about the family were attention-seeking. There were whispers from distant cousins. I always thought this was a bit much. There were casual questions about my motives, phrased like concern. You develop a radar for veiled attacks when you're used to being the beneficiary of good intentions. The radar is sharp and lonely. One afternoon, when I was going through an old email archive on the laptop, I found a directory named in a way I hadn't noticed before: Projects Confidential. Inside were scanned documents from years ago, among them a draft of an amendment to a trust we had never heard of. The draft wasn't final, it was dated 5 years prior. It said in clean legalese that the trustee could reallocate discretionary distributions under certain circumstances. On its own, this line could have been innocent. Context matters. Context in that bind was a series of transfers we had already flagged. I printed the page, took it to Grandma Rose, and watched her face as she read. Her hands, which had been steady for decades, shook a little. "I told you," she said. "I knew when she started asking about the safe deposit." That night we made a plan. Quietly confirm the document's authenticity, track any subsequent amendments, and identify who signed it and when. We would not, in other words, run to a press conference. We would not make a scene on social media. We would trace the lineage of this amendment like genealogists for wrongdoing. It was slow work, but it is the kind of work vindication asks for: patient, tedious, repetitive. It also, I realized, suited me. The thing about being abandoned at 13 is that it doesn't just teach you to survive, it teaches you to be stubborn. You learn to hold on to facts when everyone else wants to ignore them. You learn to protect yourself with a paper trail and a plan. Then, the evening the first substantial file appeared, the one that made me stop pretending this was only about petty favoritism and forced me to consider the possibility of more than carelessness, is burned into my head with the same clarity as that backdoor latch. I was late finishing a report on tuition receipts when I found a folder named MESC_payments final. It was inconspicuous. It was casual. It was the sort of name someone gives a file to make it feel unremarkable. Inside was a spreadsheet with entries labeled vendor payments, consulting, and then in a separate column a code that linked to an offshore entity. The sums, when you added them up quietly, were not astronomical in isolation, but they traced a path to accounts that, once you followed the digital breadcrumbs, didn't belong to any documented vendor. There were invoices with identical formatting but different payees. The dates clustered around times when the family office had been in flux. It read, in substance, like someone had created a channel to siphon funds under the guise of expense payments. I sat back and felt a cold clarity settle over me. This was no longer about hurt feelings at a reunion or a social slight. This file, and the obscured trail it suggested, meant there were choices being made with our resources, choices made by people who had access, authority, or both. It also meant there was a chance to stop it before it widened. I made copies. I printed the key pages, I saved metadata, I cataloged everything by time and access. I told Uncle Henry. He didn't say, "I told you so." He said, "We proceed." We weren't reckless. We began to make plans to involve outside counsel, quietly, carefully, and to reach out to people who had no familial stakes, so their voices would be seen as objective. We also thought about the risks. The risks were immediate and practical. A smear, a lawsuit, the possibility that our evidence would be ridiculed as the grumblings of a family squabble. And then, in the way these things often happen, the risk made itself visible before we could prepare our answer. A local blogger posted a piece with a headline that implied a scandal without evidence. The article quoted anonymous sources and included just enough innuendo to be dangerous. Social media picked it up. Comments piled like raindrops. "Sounds like someone wants attention," one said. "Families falling apart," said another. The article didn't mention our documents. It didn't need to. It had already constructed a narrative where loud voices equated to truth. I sat in front of my laptop and watched the comments scroll. It was astonishing how quickly a story could be bent to look like malice rather than inquiry. My stomach tightened. The truth, I had learned, was not only about proving facts, it was also about controlling how those facts were seen. A message arrived in my inbox from a friend who I hadn't realized had been on Aunt Celeste's roster. "Be careful, Maya. People are talking. Maybe keep a low profile." It was the kind of caution that reads like counsel and functions like a leash. I told Uncle Henry. He made coffee and stood with his back to the window, looking out at the wet street, and said, "This is why you build your trail. People are good at turning facts into rumors." We doubled down on documentation. We reached out to a friendly reporter, the sort who takes subpoenas seriously and who had a reputation for not being dazzled by family drama. We made a discreet appointment with a compliance consultant who specialized in trusts and fiduciary duties. We explained, in plain language, what we had found and asked, "Is this unusual?" Their answer, delivered in a tastefully carpeted office, was not dramatic, but it was unequivocal. The patterns we had highlighted were consistent with diversion, not clerical error. They asked for copies. We handed them the drives and a neat stack of printouts. At that point, our little private detective story moved to a different register. It stopped being an argument to be had at kitchen tables and started becoming evidence that could be used. That shift was terrifying and hopeful at once. I felt like someone who had found a live wire in the basement and decided to call an electrician rather than pull at it with bare hands. Then the first counterattack arrived. Not from Aunt Celeste directly. She was careful, practiced, measured. The attack came in a different form, a thinly veiled op-ed by a family friend who used to manage charity events. It called attention to reckless claims and public airing of private matters. It suggested that anyone making accusations was seeking attention. The piece didn't use my name, but it accused a shadow of me. My phone vibrated with messages from relatives who had been silent until the dust smelled interesting. Some were supportive, some alarmed, others conspicuously neutral. The message I received most often was a variant of, "Be careful how loud you get." The subtext was clear. Loudness attracts predators and lawyers. At 2 in the morning, after the op-ed and the blowback, I sat at my kitchen table and flipped through the printed spreadsheet for the umpteenth time. The numbers whispered their logic. They lined up like footprints. They were not conclusive on their own. That is the painful place where justice often begins, with enough indication to worry, but not enough to act without consequence. It was in that darkness, with the house breathing quietly around me, that I realized our enemy, if you can call it that, had more tools than I did. Not just money and influence, but a narrative machine ready to recast facts as folly. People in our family were being asked to choose whether to believe the person who had been abandoned and quietly learned how to keep receipts, or to believe a chorus of comfortable voices that wanted the mess cleaned under the carpet. I closed the laptop. I made a note to back up the drives again in the morning. Uncle Henry knocked on the kitchen door and stuck his head in with 2 mugs of coffee and his hands smelling faintly of pipe tobacco. "You look like a person who sits on the edge," he said. "Come sit over here." He didn't say it as a comfort so much as an instructor. He'd always given me instructions that felt like promises. We sat at the table and talked through what we had and what we might need. We talked about who to call first, how to present the documents if we were subpoenaed, and what the cost-benefit analysis of going to the press before the lawyers said it was sound. What scares me is not that they will deny, it's that they'll poison the well. He nodded. Which is why we must be boring and precise. Boredom is our ally. Precision is our shield. We planned to sleep on it and to reconvene in the morning. I went to bed with the lifebox under my arm like a talisman and the ledger's entries swimming behind my eyes. The house was quiet. The rain had eased. Somewhere down the street a dog barked and then fell back to sleep. I didn't know then how public the fight would become. I didn't know how many times my motives would be questioned, or how many distant cousins would suddenly have opinions on stewardship. I didn't know whether the files we had would be enough to make a prosecutor listen, or whether they would be dismissed as family squabbles. I only knew this. At 13, when they left the sandwich and the backpack, Uncle Henry had taught me to keep receipts. At 30, with a life built on those habits, I was learning to keep a line of sight on the people who sat at tables and moved money like it was an afterthought. I had a life that started with abandonment and had been steadied by a man who valued order. Now order demanded action. The email arrived at 8 in the morning. It had no subject line. The body contained 2 sentences. We have become aware of unauthorized access to internal files. Cease all activity or legal action will be taken. There was no signature. It was the kind of note that signals an escalation without naming the attacker. It was, in other words, the first clear declaration that this would not remain private. The moment the email hit my screen, everything seemed to tilt. The life box felt heavy under my arm as I walked into the kitchen to tell Uncle Henry. He took one look at the message and didn't flinch. "Good," he said. "Now we have to be smarter." That was where we were, on the cusp. We had questions, documents, and the quiet support of a grandmother who had kept a notebook as ancient and honest as a witness. We had a laptop with named files and a spreadsheet that could be read in court. And we had the knowledge that someone's story about us would be prepared if we weren't ready to tell ours. We made a list of next steps, who to call, who to inform, how to preserve everything, and then we began the work that indulgence and heartbreak have in common, the work of putting pieces together one careful, trembling bit at a time. We started by making 3 small promises to each other: no leaks, no theatrics, and absolute redundancy. Those promises sound boring when you say them out loud, and that was the point. Boring was our armor. First, Uncle Henry called an old colleague who had spent his life turning chaotic companies into neat ledgers. Marta, a compliance consultant with a small army of certifications and the patience of a saint who'd sat through 50 board meetings. Marta arrived with a leather portfolio and a soft New England accent that suggested she had once told a CEO that his projections were optimistic and survived to tell the tale. She read our spreadsheets like you read a spine for cracks. "This reads like a pattern," she said, tapping a column where anonymous payees lined up like stepping stones. "Small amounts, repeated, and then, look, a sudden uptick that covers a year when the books should have been quiet." She explained white-collar patterns in plain language: layering, which is repeated transfers meant to obscure origin; round-tripping, which is moving money in circuits to make it look legitimate; and the classic cosmetic touch, reclassifying a personal expense as consulting. She smiled once and said, "They dressed theft like accounting." Second, Uncle Henry phoned a paralegal friend of mine, Nina, who owed him a favor from a pro bono case Henry had quietly funded years ago. Nina arrived with a camera, a stack of evidence bags, and a zeal for checklists. She taught me to label everything the way the courtroom likes it: date, source, chain of custody. She told me, deadpan, "You'd be surprised how often people bring me a printout that has been printed twice and emailed 10 times, and nobody can tell which one is the original." She made me feel like we were suddenly doing something honorable instead of petty. Third, we made contact with a cautious reporter named Omar. He wasn't flashy, he wore sensible shoes and had a habit of asking for documents before he asked for quotes. "I will not put your name in a story without you saying so," he said, "but I will not let this sit as gossip." He insisted on reviewing our files, not to sensationalize them, but to see if there were public records that matched the internal trail. He checked property records, corporate filings, and old charity tax forms. He found that some donations listed as going to one place had been diverted to an LLC whose registration matched an address linked to a consultancy favoring Aunt Celeste. That match alone didn't convict anyone. It did, however, knit our private suspicion to a public thread. We kept our circle small. Grandma Rose was our quiet anchor. She delivered the notebook pages like a witness handing over her memory. A cousin, Jonah, who had felt awkward at family dinners, quietly sent screenshots of messages he had saved. Messages that, when read together, revealed a pattern of quid pro quo favors. Favors for social invitations, favors for discretionary payments. He didn't want the spotlight. He wanted to do the right thing. That wasn't negligible. When you assemble people with different competencies, compliance, paralegal discipline, journalism, and long memory, things begin to look less like coincidence and more like a map. We weren't Cyrus the investigator, we were a ragged team that kept copies and preferred paper to gossip. That made the difference when Aunt Celeste's camp tried to turn the story back on us. Their first move, predictably, was to delegitimize. A newsletter that often covered society news published a piece implying that a disgruntled relative was stirring trouble to gain favor with Uncle Henry. It was written in the soft tone of moralizing gossip, the tone privileged people use to scold those who make them uncomfortable. They included a photo of me laughing at a wedding 5 years earlier, as if past lightness were evidence of present dishonesty. The article did not mention our files. It didn't need to. It was an elegant preemptive strike, make the accuser look petty and the accusation faint. Omar, the reporter, did something practical. He published a fact-checked complement to the gossip with supporting public records that aligned with the patterns we had found. He asked the family office for comment and noted their response, "We take our stewardship seriously." He didn't claim malfeasance. He didn't have to. He reported the facts transparently and let the readers draw the obvious conclusion. His piece trended enough to wake a few people who had been asleep to what was happening in the family trust. That's when the legal letters began in earnest. The cease and desist style notes multiplied, elegant in their threat. If you continue to access or disseminate private documents, legal action will follow. They were sent from a firm that smelled like retention and reputation. They were not yet lawsuits. They were what people do when they want your fear to look like compliance. They scare you into silence. We didn't shut up. We opened a new file and labeled it Response Plan. Nina wrote a memo that could be handed to a court to establish our chain of custody. Marta drafted a short primer on why the documents mattered. Omar prepared to publish a story that would make sense of the documents without exposing sources or methods. We were making the choice to be boring and methodical. Boredom, again, was our weapon. The first real shift came when a former administrator from the family office, an exhausted man named Franklin who had been there for 2 decades, reached out through a friend of a friend. He had been careful not to appear on social media. He was not dramatic. He was simply tired, which in this line of work is a form of courage. He said he had found a thumb drive in the office that had been misplaced during a move. He feared it contained more than spreadsheets. He was right. The drive contained audio recordings, not edited or sensational, just minutes of conversations recorded during staff meetings, where payments were discussed in a way that, when listened to in context, meant something criminal more than careless. We had to treat the recordings like fragile evidence. Nina documented how Franklin came to bring it to us, who was present when it was handed over, and where it had been stored. That care mattered because in court, timing and provenance can be the difference between confession and hearsay. I listened to one recording in the kitchen while Uncle Henry watered the garden outside, as if he wasn't listening. A voice I recognized as Aunt Celeste's, notes of charm, of urgency, can be heard explaining to an operations manager that a payment was just a courtesy and no need to flag it. The operations manager laughs nervously. He mentions an intermediary company. The tiny, ordinary sounds around that exchange, a chair scraping, a plate set down, make it real in a way a clean typed sentence never could. I remember sitting very still for a minute after I finished the file. You can feel the shape of liability form in a room like you can feel temperature change. It was colder. Nina wanted to hand everything to law enforcement. Marta wanted to hold and refine and prepare a report for a prosecutor. Omar wanted to publish the recordings with legal vetting, to make public what the private had tried to hide. We did all 3 in that order. We made copies for the state's white-collar crimes unit. We prepared a packet for the U.S. Attorney's Office. They handle major fraud and interstate actions. And we asked Omar to hold for 2 weeks while we gave authorities time to act. He agreed on condition we didn't sit on the evidence indefinitely. The next part of the story is a sequence of bureaucratic, terrifying dances. Prosecutors do not move like lightning. They move like glaciers with stakes. They need corroboration, witness testimony, and the delicate choreography of warrants and subpoenas. The day the federal agents arrived, I remember the sound of the cars. Not sirens, but the almost undramatic buzz of SUVs and the polite requests of men and women in suits who had been trained to ask for what they need without theatrics. They presented badges, spoke into radios, and explained the gravity with calm. They executed warrants, legally authorized searches, with paperwork that smelled like a kitchen of civility. They were thorough, patient, and precise. That's exactly the kind of discipline Uncle Henry had tried to teach me when he said, "Paper first, drama later." Searches are oddly cinematic and also mundane. Agents methodically copied hard drives, cataloged boxes, and left receipts for what they had taken, a parallel archive that would later matter in court. They asked me to sit in a waiting room with Grandma Rose and not to talk about the case. I clung to her hand like one of the receipts she had kept all these years. She squeezed back, which was both a comfort and a confirmation. When warrants go into motion, the public moves too. The blog that had sown gossip now had to add the words "federal investigation." The difference between rumor and an official case is simple. One is noise, the other is a record. Assets were frozen on court order. A judge, after hearing affidavits from the agents and prosecutors, signed an order that prevented transactions on certain accounts. An asset freeze, in plain English, is exactly what it sounds like. Money can't move. It's not the same as a conviction, but it can be devastating in practice because it stops the ability to reallocate funds and can preserve a status quo while investigators dig. Aunt Celeste's handlers counterpunched with their own strategy, sympathetic press pieces about the stress of being under unjust suspicion, and hints that we, the rearrangers of family order, were motivated by greed. They deployed a PR person who sounded like she specialized in reputational triage. She spoke in a voice designed to make viewers feel sad for Aunt Celeste, instead of outraged on behalf of the family. Then something predictable and strange happened. People began to talk privately. Relatives who had been coy for years started to send messages about small slights, about payments that had gone unpaid, about favors called in and never returned. It turned out we were not alone. There was a network, a small but coherent constellation of people who had been inconvenienced or worse by the same patterns. Some had been in the room when a check was handed over. Some had letters showing solicitations that looked more like demands. A woman from a charity sent us bank statements that matched the entries on our spreadsheets. A handyman produced copies of checks that had been written to a company no one could name. Slowly, our solitary thread became a net. That net proved crucial. One by one, people provided affidavits, written, sworn statements that articulated what they seen. Affidavits matter because prosecutors can build a theory from enough accounts that point to an organized pattern. The recordings, plus the spreadsheets, plus the sworn words, formed a geometry that was harder to dismiss as family political theater. It was, instead, a coordinated misappropriation. It is tempting to imagine some dramatic courtroom scene where the villain's mask falls off in front of a packed gallery. Real life is less cinematic and more administratively intense. Indictments get returned by grand juries after a long presentation. Judges sign freezing orders. Trustees are suspended. Receivers are appointed to manage assets. In our case, the court appointed an independent receiver to oversee the family office while the case proceeded. The receiver is an ordinary hero in white-collar dramas, an impartial steward whose job is to prevent further mischief while investigators and lawyers do their work. I remember the day the indictment was unsealed because the headline felt strangely clinical: "Indictment filed in Family Trust Diversion Case." The language in the indictment is dry, but it matters. An indictment is a formal accusation. It meant that a grand jury had heard the evidence and believed there was probable cause to charge someone. It did not mean guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. It did mean the story would have to be answered in court. What followed was the most publicly uncomfortable part of the process: depositions, subpoenas, and hearings where family members sat across from each other as if the courtroom were a dining room with rules. People who had once laughed together now testified under oath about invoices, checks, and directives. Memory is a strange thing in litigation. People forget precisely the things that incriminate them and remember the things that redeem them. It is part performance and part truth-seeking. It is also lonely. Throughout the proceedings, Aunt Celeste's camp tried to negotiate a settlement to avoid the worst of public exposure. For a while, it seemed like an option. I will not lie, the temptation to settle, take the money and be done with it, was real. Uncle Henry, who had always been practical about money and human frailty, told me to consider with care what "done" would mean. He asked, "Do you want quiet or do you want accountability?" The question landed in the room like gravity. In the end, the case did not settle quietly. There was a guilty plea from an associate who had been central to the intermediary transfer scheme, a person who had agreed to cooperate in exchange for reduced charges. Cooperation is the currency prosecutors use when they have a knot to untie. That cooperation produced emails that linked the transfers to a small set of accounts and a trail that ultimately led back to decisions made by people in positions of trust. The associate's plea wasn't a cinematic confession. It was a legal agreement with documentation. Those emails, in turn, tightened the case. There were arrests. There were court appearances where lawyers argued hairline distinctions between bookkeeping errors and criminal intent. There were hearings where the terms fiduciary duty and breach were explained in careful English. A fiduciary is someone who is legally trusted to act in another's best interest. A breach is when they put their own interest ahead of those they are supposed to serve. The prosecutor, in plain language, asked the court to consider whether people with control over family assets had been using them for personal benefit. The judge responded by ordering temporary measures to protect assets and by setting a schedule for trials and hearings. The weeks that followed were exhausting and oddly anticlimactic in their bureaucracy. Grandmother attended every hearing she could, her hands folded over a small purse that contained, I later learned, copies of receipts she'd kept since the 70s. She sat quietly and never raised her voice. She had been the repository of memory for too long to be surprised. When she testified, the hush was absolute. There is a particular kind of silence in a courtroom that is reverent and charged and fragile. Her testimony tied corners of the story together: the notebook, the safe deposit remark, the small reimbursements that looked innocent alone and criminal in pattern. Her voice, when it came, was steady. That sense of small things forming a truth is the moral of the whole investigation. We had no single smoking gun. We had instead an accumulation of small things, disciplined and documented. Uncle Henry used to say, "Paper remembers when people won't." It wasn't a clever line in court, it was an operative fact. Legally, the case resolved in a combination of criminal plea agreements and civil settlements. Some of the accused chose to fight, others chose to accept responsibility. In the end, the court ordered the return of a portion of the diverted funds, sanctioned those found responsible, and confirmed the appointment of an independent trustee to manage the family's assets. Independent trustee is a technical phrase, and in plain language it means someone the court trusts who can act as a sober hand, a professional who won't be dazzled by social dinners or self-appointed authority. The judge's order also authorized restitution to some affected charities and set guidelines to ensure tighter oversight. It wasn't perfect. Justice never is. It was, however, a restoration that had teeth. One piece of the restoration, which matters to the title of this story, was Uncle Henry's foresight. Years before, when he had seen family governance trending toward personalities rather than procedures, he'd quietly restructured a portion of his holdings. He had set up a contingent mechanism, a clause in his small estate plan that allowed certain oversight functions to be transferred if clear evidence of malfeasance appeared. He had also funded, quietly, a reserve intended to support victims of misappropriation within our circle. He never told me about these plans until the moment they activated. That's the kind of modesty he held, doing the work and leaving the glory for someone else. Because of those provisions, and because the court found the patterns of diversion compelling, control over a segment of the family assets was shifted to a trust with clear fiduciary duties and an independent board that included a person I nominated, a compliance specialist, and 2 community representatives. I will not pretend that full restitution returned everything. Money once spent doesn't come back like a missed appointment. But what we achieved was structural. We created safeguards that would make it harder for the same thing to happen again. We wrote new rules into the game. The moment of legal victory, the one you imagine as triumphant, was quieter than I'd expected. It came in a hearing room with fluorescent lights and a judge who read orders in a calm voice. The relief was practical. The accounts we feared had been siphoned were frozen. A receiver cataloged assets. Payments to charities that had been delayed were resumed. There was, of course, more work to do. There always is. But the arc had shifted. What changed my life forever, as the title promises, was not a moment of spectacle. It was the accumulation of small, disciplined choices. Uncle Henry teaching me to keep receipts, Grandma Rose keeping her notebook, Nina labeling everything, Omar reporting with restraint, Franklin handing over a thumb drive, and the prosecutor listening. The change was structural and long-lasting. After the dust settled, the independent trustee invited me to serve on a small advisory board to help restructure the family foundation's governance. It was a position I accepted not out of a hunger for power, but out of a desire to make sure the people who relied on those funds were treated with the respect they deserved. We renamed one of the programs within the foundation the Life Box Initiative, a nod, clumsy and affectionate, to the box under Uncle Henry's bed. The initiative's mission was small and specific, to provide financial oversight support to small charities and to offer workshops on basic bookkeeping and transparency for families who found themselves managing sudden resources. We did not pretend to solve systemic inequities with a name or a workshop. We did, however, aim to make one practical thing easier, to teach people how to keep track of what they have so that predators, or incompetents, have fewer opportunities. There is a scene I return to when I think about what changed, the first board meeting we held after the court's orders. We sat around a long table with new people, lawyers used to court papers, a community organizer with a laugh like a bell, a compliance officer who liked flowcharts, and, at the head of the table, Uncle Henry with that same posture he had when he taught me to write down passwords in code. He didn't speak grandly. He asked one question: how do we make sure the money does the good it was meant for? We spent the next hours building straightforward policies, checks and balances, dual signatories for large withdrawals, quarterly independent audits, and a public dashboard for routine grants. We wanted to make the ordinary, necessary work visible because transparency is the quotidian form of justice. Family dynamics didn't resolve completely. People change gradually, if at all. There were, predictably, fractures. Some relatives felt betrayed. Others were angry that the business was now run with an outsider's hand. There were apologies that sounded rehearsed, and others that sounded sincere. I learned to distinguish between a performative reconciliation and a real one. Real reconciliation has to be earned over time. That lesson felt oddly like Uncle Henry's kind of patience. There was, though, a small circle of healing. Grandma Rose and I grew closer in a way that made me forgive time for being unkind. We took walks and we made lists of things to fix in the house. Jonah, the cousin who had been awkward at the edges of our family gatherings, began volunteering at the Lifebox initiative and found a way to reason that made people comfortable. The same cousin who had laughed the loudest at Aunt Celeste's jokes is now the person who asks inconvenient questions in board meetings and who is quietly proud of it. Franklin, the former administrator, came back as a consultant. He had a practical expertise that the new governance needed. He liked to say with wry modesty, "I just wish I'd kept better notes when I was young." I told him he had kept the notes when it mattered. Uncle Henry remained, blessedly, the same man who refused dessert. He declined public credit. When a reporter asked him why he had taken me in, he told a short version, because it was the right thing. He refused interviews that sought to make him a moral exemplar. That restraint was itself a kind of lesson. People who act because it feels right often don't want to be trophies. They want the bushel to hold the fruit without the spectacle. There were pragmatic things to manage after the hearings. The independent trustee underwent an audit and published a report. We implemented training for those who managed trust accounts, explaining in simple language what a trustee is and what a fiduciary duty requires. A trustee, we taught in public materials, has a legal and ethical obligation to act in beneficiaries' best interests, plain as that. A beneficiary, we reminded people, has a right to ask questions. We created a phone line and an email address where beneficiaries could request a simple report detailing where money was spent. The idea was to replace mystique with clarity. One of the odd rewards of the whole episode was that it created a platform. Documentary's producers reached out, not for salacious detail, but for a story about how governance can fail, and how a small band of people with patience and paperwork can make a difference. I agreed to a short documentary that focused less on the drama and more on the mechanics: how to set up a trust, why independent boards matter, and how a notebook kept by a grandmother can change the arc of a family's fortune. The film didn't make me famous. It made the Lifebox initiative visible to a few more charities who needed support with governance. Visibility in this case meant we could help a few more people set up basic protections. There were, inevitably, critics. Some argued we should have handled things privately. Others thought we had been too harsh. Those critiques are part of the cost of public action. But the best critique I heard was from a woman at a workshop who said, "You taught us how to ask the right questions." That sentence felt like an inheritance bigger than money. It was the transfer of agency. What has changed for me, personally, is not the balance in my bank account, though that stabilized. It is the confidence to trust my own way of seeing the world. Being abandoned at 13 taught me to be wary and resourceful. Being taken in by Uncle Henry taught me to be disciplined and patient. The combination of those lessons, survival instinct refined by procedure, made me the person who could hold a spreadsheet and speak to a judge and still make tea for the grandmother who kept our memory. My fate changed because the skills I acquired were small, practical, and enduring. How to ask for records, how to insist on receipts, how to insist that accountability is a form of love. I do not, in telling this story, pretend I have a blueprint that works for everyone. The system is messy, law is slow, and not every story ends with a court order. What I do believe, and what I have seen with terrible clarity, is that discipline matters, documentation matters, community matters. You don't always need grand gestures. Sometimes you need a labeled folder and a friend who will read it with you. The last scene I want to describe is ordinary and, to me, large.